Don't serve that half-breed nothing but scraps, the drunken cowboy snarls as the trembling saloon girl wipes blood from her split lip, clutching a hidden letter marked with aristocratic seals. The frontier town sees her as nothing, mixed-race trash destined for a pauper's grave in unmarked dirt. Then the wealthy cattle baron strides through those same saloon doors, his eyes finding hers across the smoke-filled room, with an intention that stops every conversation cold. What he doesn't know is that the scorned girl hiding behind that bar holds secrets that could reshape his fortune and destroy the very men who've kept this town under their economic stranglehold for years. But when those secrets surface, will their unlikely union survive the revelation that everything, her identity, the town's hatred, even their meeting, has been orchestrated by forces more powerful than either imagined? Before we continue, comment where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will publish a story there. The morning sun cast long shadows across Copper Ridge as Magnolia Thornfield scrubbed dried blood from the Silver Dollar Saloon's wooden floors. Her calloused hands moved in practiced circles while she tucked a cream-colored envelope deeper into her apron pocket. The letter bore the elegant seal of a Charleston law firm, the third one this month she'd hidden from prying eyes. The saloon doors creaked open as the first patrons stumbled in for their breakfast whiskey. Magnolia kept her head down, knowing what was coming. The cowhands from the nearby ranches always started the same way. "Well, look what crawled out from under a rock," sneered Jake Morrison, tossing his hat onto a table. "Half-breeds still here polluting the air." Magnolia stood slowly, smoothing her worn brown dress. She'd learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. Instead, she walked behind the bar and began arranging glasses with precise movements that spoke of careful breeding. "You deaf, girl?" Morrison slammed his fist on the bar. "I asked for whiskey." She poured without meeting his eyes. Morrison grabbed the bottle and deliberately spilled it across her hands. The amber liquid burned the cuts on her knuckles from yesterday's similar encounter. "Clumsy thing can't even pour straight," Morrison laughed. His companions joined in, their voices echoing off the saloon's tin ceiling. From his corner table, Cornelius Blackwood watched the scene unfold over his morning newspaper. The banker's sharp eyes never missed anything, especially when it involved Magnolia. He'd been watching her closely ever since those fancy letters started arriving. Something about the girl didn't add up. Her posture was too straight, her speech too careful when she forgot to hide it. Blackwood folded his paper and approached the bar. "Miss Thornfield," he said, savoring the way she flinched at her surname. "I need to discuss your employment situation with Bill." The saloon owner emerged from the back room, wiping his hands on a dirty apron. Bill Henderson was a decent man, trapped between his conscience and his business. "Morning, Mr. Blackwood," Henderson said nervously. "What can I do for you?" "The respectable women of this town have concerns," Blackwood's voice carried across the room. "Having someone of her sort serving drinks reflects poorly on our community standards." Magnolia's hands stilled on the glass she was cleaning. She knew this day would come. Blackwood had been circling like a vulture for weeks. "Now see here," Henderson began, but Blackwood raised his hand. "Your loan payment is due next week, Bill. I'd hate for personal sympathies to cloud your business judgment." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke. Henderson's shoulders sagged. "I'll consider your concerns, Mr. Blackwood." Magnolia felt the walls closing in. Without this job, she'd have nowhere to go. No respectable establishment would hire her. The boarding house would evict her within days. The saloon doors burst open with unusual force. Pearl Mackenzie swept in wearing her finest blue dress. Followed by 3 other women from the town's social circle, the sheriff's daughter commanded attention wherever she went, her blonde curls and fair skin marking her as everything Magnolia was not. "Papa says there's been talk of improper behavior in this establishment," Pearl announced, her green eyes finding Magnolia immediately. "Decent folk shouldn't have to endure certain unpleasant sights while conducting business." The message was clear. Magnolia began untying her apron, accepting defeat. She'd survived worse than this. Maybe it was time to stop hiding and read those letters from Charleston. But Henderson surprised everyone. This girl works harder than any 3 men I've employed. She keeps perfect books and hasn't stolen so much as a penny. Pearl's face flushed. Papa won't approve of you taking sides with her kind against respectable citizens. Your papa's not my boss, Henderson said quietly, but his voice wavered. Reverend Samuel Cross entered during the tense exchange. The preacher's weathered face showed the strain of trying to balance Christian charity with social expectations. His congregation included both the powerful families who funded his church and his personal beliefs about human dignity. "Good morning, everyone," Cross said carefully. "I trust we're all conducting ourselves as neighbors should." Blackwood smiled coldly. "Just discussing community standards, Reverend. I'm sure you agree that certain influences can corrupt the moral fiber of our town." Cross's eyes found Magnolia's face. He saw intelligence there, and dignity despite her circumstances. But he also saw the foreclosure notice Blackwood held over half his congregation. "We're all God's children," Cross said finally, the compromise bitter in his mouth. Pearl laughed. "Some children wander further from grace than others." Magnolia finally looked up, her dark eyes flashing with controlled anger. For just a moment, her carefully hidden education showed through. "Perhaps grace finds us in unexpected places, Miss Mackenzie." The refined diction caught everyone off guard. Pearl stepped backward, suddenly uncertain. Blackwood's interest sharpened. That wasn't how a simple saloon girl spoke. His suspicions about those Charleston letters intensified. The moment shattered when the batwing doors swung open one more time. A tall figure filled the doorway, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. Big Jim Whitmore removed his hat, revealing steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. The wealthy cattle baron's gaze swept the room before settling on Magnolia. Something passed between them, a recognition that made Pearl's breath catch, and Blackwood's calculations shift entirely. "Ma'am," Jim said directly to Magnolia, ignoring everyone else. "Might I request the pleasure of your company for a dance this evening?" The Silver Dollar Saloon fell completely silent. Outside, a horse whinnied, and wagon wheels creaked past. Inside, the most powerful man in 3 counties had just asked the most despised woman to dance. The silence stretched like a taut rope, ready to snap. Jim Whitmore stood in the doorway, his hand still extended toward Magnolia, waiting for her answer. Every eye in the Silver Dollar burned with shock and anticipation. Pearl Mackenzie's face drained of color. She'd spent months positioning herself to catch the cattle baron's attention. Her father had arranged 3 separate introductions. She'd worn her finest dresses to church, hoping Jim would notice her across the pews. "I believe you're mistaken, Mr. Whitmore." Pearl stepped forward, her voice strained. "Surely you meant to address someone else." Jim's eyes never left Magnolia's face. "I meant exactly what I said." Magnolia felt the weight of every stare pressing down on her shoulders. Her fingers trembled as she smoothed her worn apron. Dancing with Jim Whitmore would change everything. There would be no going back to the shadows. "I don't know how to dance properly," she whispered. "Then I'll teach you," Jim said simply. Cornelius Blackwood watched the exchange with growing alarm. If Jim Whitmore showed interest in Magnolia, others might follow. People might start asking questions about her background. Those Charleston letters could become public knowledge. "Mr. Whitmore," Blackwood interrupted smoothly, "perhaps you're not aware of certain circumstances regarding this particular individual." Jim turned slowly. His reputation for dealing with troublemakers was legendary across 3 territories. "What circumstances might those be, banker?" Blackwood felt sweat beading on his forehead. "Well, her breeding, naturally. Mixed blood carries certain inherent problems. The only problem I see is grown men bullying a hard-working woman." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jake Morrison and his cowhands suddenly found their boots fascinating. Even Pearl stepped backward. Henderson cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Whitmore, sir, maybe we could discuss this privately." "Nothing to discuss," Jim said. "I asked the lady a question. I'm waiting for her answer." Magnolia looked around the room at the faces surrounding her. Some showed disgust, Others displayed curiosity. A few revealed fear of what her acceptance might mean for the town's social order. She thought about the letters hidden in her room, the inheritance waiting in Charleston, the life she could claim if she found the courage to reach for it. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd be honored to dance with you, Mr. Whitmore." Pearl's composure finally cracked. "This is disgraceful. Papa will hear about this shameful display." "Your papa's welcome to discuss his concerns with me directly," Jim replied. The next 3 days brought a transformation to Copper Ridge that no one had expected. Jim Whitmore appeared at the Silver Dollar every evening, spending hours in quiet conversation with Magnolia. He treated her with a respect that made the other patrons uncomfortable. Word spread quickly through the small town. The telegraph operator's wife told the general store owner. The blacksmith mentioned it to the doctor. By Sunday morning, every resident knew about the unlikely courtship. Reverend Cross struggled through his sermon while watching Jim and Magnolia sit together in the back pew. Half his congregation whispered among themselves. The other half stared in stunned silence. After service, Pearl cornered her father outside the church. Sheriff Mackenzie was a practical man who understood politics better than principles. "You have to do something, Papa," Pearl hissed. "This situation reflects poorly on our entire community." "Jim Whitmore's not breaking any laws, sweetheart. But surely there are regulations about public decency." Mackenzie sighed. He'd been fielding complaints all week from the town's leading families. Pressure was mounting for official action. Meanwhile, Blackwood worked behind the scenes with calculated precision. He visited struggling families throughout the week, reminding them of overdue loan payments. The message was clear without being spoken directly. The widow Thompson faced foreclosure on her boarding house. Her mortgage payment was already 2 months behind. When Blackwood suggested that housing certain undesirable elements might impact her loan renewal, she understood perfectly. The general store owner received a similar visit. His inventory credit depended on Blackwood's goodwill. Supporting the wrong people could prove expensive. By Thursday evening, Magnolia noticed the change. Former customers avoided eye contact. The boarding house served her smaller portions. Even children threw rocks when she walked past their yards, but something else was changing too. Jim's attention had awakened something in Magnolia that she'd buried years ago. Her posture straightened. Her voice grew stronger. The careful refinement she'd hidden began emerging naturally. "You speak differently than most folks around here," Jim observed during one of their conversations. Magnolia tensed. "I read books sometimes." "What kind of books?" She hesitated, then decided on partial truth. "Poetry, history, whatever I can find." Jim nodded approvingly. "Education's important. Not everyone appreciates that around here." That night, Magnolia finally opened one of the Charleston letters. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Augustus Thornfield's estate required immediate attention from his sole heir. Delays were complicating the settlement process. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her hiding place. Soon she would have to decide between the safety of obscurity and the dangerous promise of claiming her birthright. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Blackwood had called for a town meeting. The subject was listed simply as community standards and moral concerns. The battle lines were drawn. Jim Whitmore's courtship had forced Copper Ridge to confront questions they'd preferred to ignore. Now the entire town would be forced to choose sides. The town hall filled beyond capacity on Friday evening. Every chair was occupied, with late arrivals standing along the walls. The air grew thick with tension and body heat as Copper Ridge's residents gathered for what everyone knew would be a reckoning. Cornelius Blackwood stood at the front podium, his banker's suit pressed to perfection. Behind him sat the town's most influential citizens. Pearl Mackenzie held court among the women, her supporters arranged like soldiers ready for battle. Jim Whitmore entered with Magnolia on his arm. The gesture sent ripples of shock through the assembled crowd. He'd made his position unmistakably clear by escorting her publicly to this very meeting called to condemn their relationship. Reverend Cross sat in the front row, his weathered hands folded in prayer. The weight of moral leadership pressed down on his shoulders. His congregation expected him to speak against the union, but his conscience wrestled with deeper truths. "Friends and neighbors," Blackwood began, his voice carrying across the packed room, "we gather tonight to address concerns about our community's moral foundation." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Blackwood had spent the week carefully orchestrating this moment, applying financial pressure where it would be most effective. "Certain recent developments threaten the values that built this town," Blackwood continued. "We must consider what kind of example we're setting for our children." Magnolia felt the hostile stares burning into her from every direction. Her fingers tightened on Jim's arm, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, stood up. Her mortgage payment was 3 weeks overdue, and Blackwood's recent visit had made the consequences of her choice crystal clear. "Some associations reflect poorly on our entire community," she said reluctantly. "Parents worry about influences on their children's moral development." Nods and voiced agreements filled the room. Blackwood smiled with satisfaction. His financial web was working perfectly. Sheriff Mackenzie rose next, his badge catching the lamplight. "Public order requires certain standards. When those standards are challenged, it affects everyone's safety." The implication hung heavy in the air. Official disapproval could lead to official action. Jim stood slowly, his considerable height commanding immediate attention. The room fell silent as every person waited to hear how the cattle baron would defend his scandalous choice. "I've listened to concerns about moral standards," Jim said, his voice carrying easily to the back rows. "But I haven't heard anyone explain what's immoral about treating a hard-working woman with respect." Pearl shot to her feet, her carefully controlled facade finally cracking. "It's not about respect. It's about propriety and social order." "Whose social order?" Jim asked quietly. The question caught Pearl off guard. She'd expected anger or defensiveness, not this calm challenge to the foundation of their arguments. Blackwood stepped forward to regain control. "Mr. Whitmore, surely you understand the complications that arise from crossing certain natural boundaries." "The only boundary I see is the one between decent behavior and cruelty." Magnolia watched the exchange with growing amazement. No one had ever defended her so publicly or so powerfully. But she also recognized the danger. Jim's wealth and influence provided some protection, but even he couldn't stand against an entire town indefinitely. The pressure was building toward an explosive conclusion when something inside Magnolia shifted. Years of hiding, of accepting abuse, of denying her own worth suddenly felt unbearable. She stood up beside Jim, her movement catching everyone by surprise. The refined posture that she'd spent years concealing emerged naturally as she faced the hostile crowd. "You want to discuss moral standards," she said, her voice carrying an authority that made several people lean forward. "Then let's discuss the morality of grown adults terrorizing someone for circumstances beyond her control." The educated diction and confident bearing stunned the room. This wasn't the submissive saloon girl they'd been tormenting. Something had fundamentally changed. Blackwood felt alarm bells ringing in his head. This transformation confirmed his worst fears about those Charleston letters. If Magnolia was claiming her true identity, his careful financial arrangements could collapse overnight. "You speak above your station," Blackwood said sharply. "Do I?" Magnolia reached into her reticule and withdrew a cream-colored envelope bearing elegant legal seals. "Or perhaps my station isn't what you've assumed." The room erupted in whispers as people recognized the expensive stationery and formal presentation. This wasn't the correspondence of a simple working woman. Pearl stared in shock. Something was happening that she didn't understand, but it threatened everything she'd believed about social hierarchy and her own position within it. Reverend Cross felt his heart racing. He'd sensed something different about Magnolia from their first meeting, but he'd never imagined anything like this revelation. "Charleston Law Firm," Magnolia continued, holding the envelope where everyone could see the return address, "regarding the estate of Augustus Thornfield." Several people gasped. The Thornfield name was legendary throughout the South. Their plantation had been one of the largest and most profitable before the war. Blackwood's face went pale. If Magnolia was truly a Thornfield heir, she controlled wealth that dwarfed his own holdings. More dangerously, She might discover what he'd done with the estate funds he'd been managing. "That's impossible," Pearl stammered. "She's just a saloon girl." "Is she?" Jim asked, looking at Magnolia with new understanding. Her grace, her intelligence, her natural dignity suddenly made perfect sense. Magnolia felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. She could retreat back into hiding, apologize for the disruption, and return to her life of quiet suffering. Or she could step fully into the light and claim everything that was rightfully hers. The decision crystallized as she looked around the room at faces filled with shock, fear, and dawning comprehension. These people had spent years believing they were superior to her. Now they would learn the truth about power, breeding, and worth. She opened the envelope with deliberate precision, unfolded the legal document inside, and began to read aloud in a voice that commanded absolute attention throughout the packed town hall. The legal document rustled in the sudden silence as Magnolia's clear voice cut through the thick air of the town hall. Every word she read transformed the reality everyone thought they understood about power and position in Copper Ridge. Miss Magnolia Thornfield is hereby recognized as the sole surviving heir to the Augustus Thornfield estate, valued at approximately $200,000 in land, investments, and liquid assets. Gasps echoed through the packed room. $200,000 represented more wealth than most residents could imagine. Pearl Mackenzie's face went ashen as the implications crashed over her like a cold wave. Cornelius Blackwood felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening chill. For 3 years he'd been managing portions of that estate through carefully forged correspondence, believing the rightful heir would never surface to claim it. His elaborate embezzlement scheme suddenly faced complete exposure. Furthermore, Magnolia continued reading, immediate action is required to prevent further deterioration of estate assets currently held in trust by regional financial institutions. Jim Whitmore watched the transformation with growing admiration. The woman beside him had shed years of careful disguise in a single moment. Her bearing, her diction, her natural authority all spoke of breeding that no amount of money could purchase. Reverend Cross felt his earlier moral confusion evaporating. He'd been wrestling with whether to support someone he believed was a powerless victim. Now he realized he was witnessing something far more significant than a simple courtship controversy. "This changes nothing," Pearl declared desperately, though her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Inherited money doesn't alter fundamental character issues." "Doesn't it?" Magnolia folded the document carefully and looked directly at her former tormentors. "What character issues concern you now, Miss Mackenzie?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Pearl had spent months positioning herself as Copper Ridge's social leader, the natural choice for Jim Whitmore's affections. Her entire identity was built on assumed superiority over people exactly like Magnolia. Blackwood realized he needed to regain control quickly or face complete disaster. His financial manipulation of the town depended on maintaining existing power structures. If Magnolia claimed her inheritance, she could expose every fraudulent transaction he'd engineered. "Legal documents can be forged," he announced loudly. "We shouldn't accept such claims without proper investigation." "Excellent suggestion," Magnolia replied smoothly. "I'm sure the territorial marshal would be happy to verify authenticity. Perhaps he could examine other financial documents while he's here." The banker's blood turned to ice water. A federal investigation would uncover every illegal scheme he'd constructed over the past 5 years. His embezzlement of estate funds was just the beginning. Jim stepped closer to Magnolia, his protective instincts sharpening as he watched Blackwood's reaction. Something dangerous was happening beneath the surface of this confrontation. Mrs. Patterson, the school teacher, finally found her voice. "If this is true, why hide it? Why work in a saloon instead of claiming your rightful position?" Magnolia's expression softened slightly. This was the question she'd been dreading but knew she had to answer. "Because I learned early that wealth doesn't protect people like me from hatred," she said simply. "I thought hiding would be safer than fighting." The honesty in her voice made several people shift uncomfortably in their chairs. They'd spent years tormenting someone who could have destroyed them financially with a single telegram to Charleston. Sheriff Mackenzie cleared his throat nervously. As the town's law enforcement, he was beginning to understand the legal implications of what had been revealed. If Magnolia was truly a Thornfield heir, several recent actions against her might constitute serious crimes. Perhaps we should adjourn this meeting, he suggested weakly. Allow time for proper verification of these claims. No, Blackwood said sharply. We need to settle this matter tonight. His desperation was becoming obvious to anyone paying attention. Jim's years of reading men in business negotiations told him exactly what was happening. The banker was terrified of investigation because he had something significant to hide. "What's your hurry, Blackwood?" Jim asked quietly. The question hit its target perfectly. Blackwood's composure cracked visibly as he realized his panic was showing. "I simply believe in thorough examination of extraordinary claims," he stammered. Magnolia watched the banker's growing distress with sharp intelligence. Her years of observing people from behind the saloon bar had taught her to read fear and guilt. Blackwood's reactions suggested something far more serious than simple prejudice. "Mr. Blackwood," she said carefully, "as the estate's designated trustee in this region, surely you can verify these documents immediately." The room went completely silent. Nobody had known that Blackwood was connected to the Thornfield estate. The banker's face went pale as he realized his secret relationship had been exposed. "Trustee?" Jim's voice carried deadly quiet. "You've been managing her inheritance?" Blackwood looked around the room desperately, seeking escape from the trap that was closing around him. Every face showed growing suspicion and anger as people began understanding the true scope of his deception. "There are complex legal considerations," he said weakly. "Such as?" Magnolia stepped forward, her aristocratic bearing now fully emerged. "Such as where my estate funds have been invested. Such as why you've spent 3 years convincing this town to hate me while secretly managing my family's wealth?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Blackwood realized that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him, and the woman he'd helped persecute held the power to destroy him completely. The accusation shattered the last pretense of civility in the packed town hall. Blackwood stood frozen as every eye turned toward him with dawning comprehension. The respected banker who controlled half the town's financial future had been exposed as a fraud. "That's a serious charge," Sheriff Mackenzie said slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his badge. The political calculations in his mind were shifting rapidly as he realized which side of this conflict would ultimately prevail. Jim stepped protectively closer to Magnolia, but she didn't need his shield anymore. 3 years of hiding had ended in this moment of complete revelation. Her spine straightened with inherited authority as she faced down the man who had orchestrated her suffering. "Show them the foreclosure notices, Mr. Blackwood," she said with deadly calm. "Explain how a banker manages to threaten half the town with financial ruin while supposedly managing a $200,000 trust fund." Pearl Mackenzie watched in horror as her world crumbled around her. The social order she'd depended upon was revealing itself as an elaborate construction built on lies and stolen money. Her father's position, her family's status, even her own sense of superiority suddenly seemed fragile as morning mist. Reverend Cross rose from his front row seat, his weathered face showing the strain of moral awakening. "Cornelius, is this true? Have you been using estate funds for personal lending?" The banker's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His carefully rehearsed explanations had evaporated under the weight of public exposure. Around the room, faces that had shown him deference for years now displayed growing anger and betrayal. Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "My mortgage payments. You said the bank was struggling. That's why you raised my interest rates." "Mine too," called out the blacksmith from the back of the room. "You claimed Eastern investors were demanding higher returns." One by one, Blackwood's victims began speaking up. The widow Thompson described impossible loan terms. The general store owner detailed arbitrary payment schedule changes. A pattern of systematic financial abuse emerged that made everyone's previous concerns about social propriety seem absurdly trivial. Magnolia listened to each testimony with growing fury. Blackwood hadn't simply stolen her inheritance money. He'd used it to terrorize and control innocent families throughout Copper Ridge. "You want to discuss moral standards," she said, her refined voice carrying to every corner of the packed hall. "Let's examine the morality of a man who steals from orphans to fund his schemes." Jim's business experience filled in the remaining blanks. "You've been lending out her money at high interest while keeping her inheritance tied up in legal delays, double profit from the same stolen funds." Blackwood finally found his voice, but it emerged as a desperate croak. "The estate required active management. I was protecting assets from deterioration." By terrorizing the rightful heir into hiding? Magnolia's aristocratic breeding showed in every syllable. By encouraging an entire town to treat her as less than human while you lived off her family's wealth? The room erupted in angry voices as people began connecting Blackwood's financial pressure to their own treatment of Magnolia. They'd been manipulated into cruelty to serve his embezzlement scheme. Sheriff Mackenzie felt the political winds shifting decisively. Supporting Blackwood now would be career suicide. The banker had made enemies of too many voters. "Mr. Blackwood," he said officially, "I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation of these financial irregularities." Panic flashed across the banker's face. He bolted toward the side door, knocking over chairs in his desperate flight. Jim moved with surprising speed for such a large man, blocking the exit with his considerable bulk. "Going somewhere. Cornelius." Blackwood spun around wildly, looking for another escape route. The packed crowd blocked every exit. His empire of fear and manipulation was collapsing into a trap of his own making. "This is all lies," he shouted desperately. "She's not a real Thornfield. Mixed blood can't inherit southern estates." The words hung in the air like a confession. Everyone present now understood exactly how deep his knowledge of the inheritance went, and how far he'd been willing to go to steal it. Magnolia walked slowly toward the cornered banker, her movements displaying the grace of generations of aristocratic breeding. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of inherited wealth and moral certainty. "Augustus Thornfield was my father," she said clearly. "He acknowledged me legally in his will, which you've obviously read carefully while stealing my birthright." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a second document, this one bearing even more impressive seals. His personal letter explaining why he chose to leave everything to his daughter rather than his distant cousins who disapproved of his choices. The room fell completely silent as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Magnolia wasn't just wealthy. She was the chosen heir of one of the South's most respected families, selected by her father over more conventional options. Pearl felt her last hopes crumbling. She'd spent months competing with a saloon girl for Jim Whitmore's attention, only to discover she'd been competing with Southern aristocracy. Jim looked at Magnolia with new understanding and deeper respect. Her courage in hiding rather than fighting had protected her from dangers he was only beginning to comprehend. Blackwood sagged against the blocked door as Sheriff Mackenzie approached with handcuffs. His scheme had required Magnolia to remain powerless and isolated. Now she stood revealed as potentially the wealthiest person in 3 counties, backed by legal documentation and moral authority that made his position hopeless. "The territorial marshal will want to examine your books," Mackenzie said grimly. "All of them." As the handcuffs clicked shut, Blackwood's reign of financial terror officially ended, leaving Copper Ridge to face the consequences of 3 years of systematic deception and manufactured hatred. The morning sun streamed through the windows of what had once been the Silver Dollar Saloon, as Magnolia arranged wooden desks in neat rows. 3 months had passed since Blackwood's arrest, and the transformation of both the building and the town seemed almost miraculous. Jim entered carrying lumber for new bookshelves, his sleeves rolled up and his face showing the satisfaction of honest work. The cattle baron had discovered that building something meaningful brought deeper fulfillment than merely accumulating wealth. "The Charleston shipment arrived this morning," he announced, setting down the boards. 200 books, just like you ordered." Magnolia smiled as she surveyed their progress. The former saloon now resembled a proper schoolhouse with maps on the walls and a large blackboard where the bar had once stood. Sunlight replaced the dim lamplight that had hidden so much cruelty and deception. Pearl Mackenzie appeared in the doorway, carrying a basket of fresh supplies. The transformation in the sheriff's daughter had been perhaps the most remarkable of all. Gone was the entitled young woman who had demanded social deference. In her place stood someone who had learned hard lessons about the difference between earned respect and inherited privilege. Mrs. Patterson sent primer books for the younger children, Pearl said quietly. Her voice still carried traces of shame when addressing Magnolia directly. "Thank you," Magnolia replied with genuine warmth. "Your help with the reading program has made all the difference." The acknowledgement brought a flush of pride to Pearl's cheeks. She'd spent weeks proving her commitment to the community school, working alongside the woman she had once tried to destroy. Reverend Cross entered with a small group of children trailing behind him. The preacher's face glowed with satisfaction as he watched youngsters of different backgrounds chattering together without the artificial barriers their parents had constructed. "Morning lessons are ready to begin," he announced. "I see we have perfect attendance again." The children took their seats with eager anticipation. Magnolia had proven to be a gifted teacher, combining the refined education of her Charleston upbringing with genuine care for each student's individual needs. As the morning progressed, the sound of young voices reciting lessons filled the air where drunken arguments had once echoed. The transformation seemed to have healing power that extended far beyond simple education. Sheriff Mackenzie appeared during the arithmetic lesson, his badge catching the sunlight. The lawman's relationship with his daughter had improved dramatically once she'd abandoned her prejudiced attitudes and embraced meaningful work. "Territorial Marshal's final report came through," he told Magnolia quietly. "Blackwood will be spending the next 15 years in federal prison. Full restitution has been ordered for everyone he defrauded." The news brought visible relief to several parents whose children attended the school. Their families would finally be free from the crushing debt that had forced them into complicity with Blackwood's schemes. Jim paused in his construction work to listen. Justice had been served. But the real victory was happening in this room every day as children learned to see each other as individuals rather than categories. During the lunch break, Magnolia walked outside to find a small crowd gathered around a wooden sign that Jim was installing beside the front door. The carefully carved letters read, "Thornfield Community School, all welcome." Mrs. Patterson approached with tears in her eyes. The schoolteacher had become one of Magnolia's strongest supporters after witnessing her natural gift for education. "I never imagined anything like this was possible," she said softly, "when I think about how we treated you." "The past matters less than what we build together now," Magnolia replied. Her aristocratic breeding showed not in condescension, but in the gracious forgiveness that came from genuine strength of character. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors as an elegant carriage pulled up outside the school. Well-dressed passengers emerged, their fine clothes marking them as people of considerable importance. "Miss Thornfield," the lead gentleman announced formally, "I'm Attorney Harrison from the Charleston firm handling your estate. We've come to discuss expanding your educational initiatives." Magnolia's success in Copper Ridge had attracted attention throughout the territory. Her innovative approach to integrated education was being studied as a model for other communities struggling with similar challenges. Jim joined the conversation, his role as Magnolia's partner extending far beyond their personal relationship. Together, they had created something that neither could have accomplished alone. "We're prepared to fund similar schools in 6 other towns," the attorney continued. "Your father's estate will support a lasting legacy of educational opportunity." The offer represented everything Augustus Thornfield had hoped for when he chose his daughter as his heir. He had recognized that inherited wealth meant nothing without the wisdom and character to use it meaningfully. As evening approached, the last students departed with homework assignments and cheerful goodbyes. Magnolia and Jim stood together in the transformed space, surrounded by the evidence of what determination and justice could accomplish. Pearl lingered after the others had left, clearly wanting to say something important. Her struggle with pride and genuine remorse played across her face before she finally found the courage to speak. "I wrote letters to 3 other towns requesting information about starting community schools," she said quietly. "With your permission, I'd like to help establish them." The request represented complete transformation from the young woman who had once demanded Magnolia's exile. Now she sought to spread the very principles she had initially opposed. "I'd be honored to work with you," Magnolia replied. As the sun set over Copper Ridge, the town bore little resemblance to the place where a mixed-race saloon girl had once scrubbed blood from wooden floors. The Thornfield Community School stood as proof that dignity, strategic intelligence, and moral courage could triumph over the deepest prejudices. Jim and Magnolia walked home together as husband and wife, their marriage having become a symbol of possibility rather than scandal. Behind them, the school waited for tomorrow's lessons in a community that had learned to value character over appearance and justice over comfortable lies.